Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean Hsueh. I'm the director of the China program at Shorenstein A Park, also a professor of political science. And today we have a special treat. We sometimes have what I think we just call a forthcoming book talk to give you a head start on exciting new books that are going to be published. And today we're very pleased to have Professor Roselyn Hsueh, who has a new book coming out with Cambridge University Press. It will be coming out in May, and I was told that it's coming out in both paperback and hardcover, and you can get it on Amazon as well as Cambridge University Press. This is titled MicroInstitutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization, China, India, and Russia. So that's, I think, a very timely and important topic. And I won't take up too much time, but this book is going to explore the post-Cold War relationship between internal development and integration into the global economy of developing countries, the countries being China, Russia, and India. Let me just say a few words about Professor Hsueh. We won't hold it against her that she both got her BA and PhD in political science from that school across the bay, UC Berkeley. But she's since then gone on, and she currently is an associate professor of political science at Temple University, where she co-directs the certificate in political economy. And she's a member of the Global Studies and Asian Studies at Temple. She has her research area is international comparative political economy of development. She looks at China's foreign economic engagement and its political impact on the developing world. And her first book was China's Regulatory State, a New Strategy for Globalization. So we're glad that she's not only sort of expanding, looking at China and the world, but she's sort of focusing, going in and looking also at in more depth in India and Russia. And I think this is a very timely topic, her work that today, and I given the increasingly close relationship between China and Russia, perhaps you'll have some comments on that as well. Our format today is going to be the usual. Our speaker will talk for about between 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will have question and answer. And I invite you all to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and then I will curate the questions and present them to Professor Hsueh. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Rosie.
Great, thank you so much, Jean, for that very welcome to Stanford today. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone today for joining us in my presentation of my forthcoming book. And one thing I do want to point out is that, as Professor Hsueh, as Jean had mentioned, I am a Cal Bear, and as deep as I am as a Cal Bear, I do want to mention that I do have some roots here at Stanford. One fact is that in between college and graduate school back at Berkeley, my first job was actually at Stanford. I was the research assistant for Larry Diamond of FSI, in fact. And so it's always nice to return to Stanford and to present my research. And today I will be presenting research on my new book. And so here, let me go ahead and share screen, and so we can start the PowerPoint presentation. So as Professor Hsueh had mentioned, my book, MicroInstitutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia, is forthcoming and will be out in May. And it is such a pleasure to be able to share this book. This book builds on my earlier work on China, on my first book, China's Regulatory State, a New Strategy for Globalization. And in many ways, what it does is it demystifies the globalization trajectories of these three large developing emerging powers since the end of the Cold War, since the end of the Cold War, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Big Bang globalization in India, and famously Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, which in many ways opened up China to the outside world, and post Tiananmen Square incident. And so what I do here is I demystify the globalization trajectories in the age of neoliberalism, in a time when the dominant perspective is that these countries are, kind of, liberalizing and converging into a neoliberal model. And that, particularly as they become members of the World Trade Organization. What I found in my earlier work is that, in fact, we have to disaggregate the national economy and go to the sector level, go to the industry and go to the subsector. And only then, once we've disaggregated the macro economy and allowing the analytical utility of going to the micro-sectoral level, can we really understand the globalizing trajectories of these very complex economies during this new age of globalization. And one thing I always like to do when I present is I like to show photos from fieldwork. And so here I have in front of you two images of what I saw when I was in the field. On the one hand, on the left side is of a bookstore right next to the Red Square in Moscow. And the other image on the right-hand side is of books that I saw in a bookstore in Wangfujing in Beijing. And as we could tell, these two countries and the peoples within them are also interested on demystifying and understanding what actually motivates leaders, what motivates leaders as they respond to internal and external pressures, as they respond to societal forces. And this is true regardless of regime type, right? One of the countries I have systematically examined in this book is India, which is, unlike China and Russia, a democracy. And so what I hope to do in this book is to introduce to this new framework of looking at globalization trajectories that could be informative regardless of regime type. What I do, though, is to say that regime type does matter. We can't discount regime type, but that in the context of complex interdependence during the age of economic integration, it is important to also look at other factors, in an array of factors, in what I bring together in the strategic value framework, which then allows us to hold constant certain factors and be able to understand these complex trajectories, and to be able to understand why is it that authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, despite political restrictions and political closeness, at the same time could be so well integrated into the global economy that countries like the United States in many ways have to respond to some of the complexities that have resulted in this age of globalization. And so the motivation is that everyone assumes that there is a model to explain transition economies. And they assume that there's these national level linear unitary globalization trajectories. And I find that in fact, that is not true. But what is true is that these economies appear to have departed from the East Asian developmental state, which restricted foreign direct investment to promote the domestic sector. And during the East Asian developmental states globalization process, during the Cold War, they had, the allied nations, European and American markets. And so in many ways, these East Asian newly industrialized countries had the luxury of being able to restrict foreign direct investment, but at the same time still have export markets. the models of China, India, and Russia also differ from the liberal Latin America model, this model of openness to foreign direct investment. But as a result, scholars have found had historically exploited, along with local interests, development outcomes, societal relations. And so in many ways, these countries are liberalizing their economies in the age of globalization, having departed from these iconic models, the East Asian developmental state and the Latin American model. And what I found is that when we go to the microsectoral level, and once we disaggregate, we're going to see that these economies, in fact, haven't been entirely liberal, and that yet at the same time, they haven't been entirely restrictive of foreign direct investment. But that there have been places on the microsectoral level where they have, in fact, re-regulated in ways that at times are helpful for development outcomes, but at times not so helpful, and at times motivated by political factors as these countries respond to internal and external pressures, and not always motivated by economic factors. And so just some data to show you that in the 1980s, before these economies opened up, FDI as a percentage of GDP was quite low in 1980. Fast forward 15 years later, in all three economies, FDI has become a relatively large part of the GDP, and comparable to the United States and other countries of comparable size. 15 years later, FDI as a percentage of GDP is still quite high, and relative to other countries of comparable size, and to a point to say that, yeah, in many ways, these countries are open and globalized. As we compare their FDI as a percentage of GDP across time with each other, they have, obviously ebbs and flows, but in some ways converged by the late 2010s. And this is true for trade too. Here, some data for exports of goods and services as percentage of GDP for these countries. As I mentioned, though, as open as they are, all these countries, all three countries have re-regulated in ways that vary by country and sector within them, leading to certain pretty distinct development outcomes. And how do we understand that? How do we demystify that? I want to just show you one measure of development outcome, which is science and technology patents. And here, the conventional wisdom, and to some extent on the macro level, it appears to be true, is that China outperforms India and Russia in terms of science and technology patents. But yet, once we disaggregate and take it to the sector, what we find is that, in fact, it actually varies. Here, one of the sectors that I study, telecommunications, and then also subsectors within information communications technology, is what we find is that that conventional wisdom data about China outperforming India and Russia is in fact not necessarily true once we take it to the subsector. And here is just data at one measure of development outcomes for a few of the sectors that I study. And so what is the relationship between internal development and global integration? How and why do state-market relations differ? And what are some of the implications for development and also post-Cold War era of global conflict and cooperation? I'm going to just front load my arguments here. And if I don't come to as much detail on the empirical data as possible, I'm very happy to answer these questions during Q&A. But front loading some of the arguments, I make this argument that the perceived strategic value of sector, interacting with sectoral structures and path-dependent organization of institutions will shape national and within country sectoral patterns of market governance. And these patterns of market governance will have implications for development outcomes and how these countries on the national level interact with other economies and other sectors, with implications for behaviors of firms and industries. And these national configuration of sectoral models, what I call them, will have impact. And I may have some questions about China-Russia relations, or how some of these dominant patterns of market governance that I have found, particularly in the post-2014 Crimea annexation, have implications for Russia today. So happy to answer those questions, but just front-loading some of these arguments. Front-loading some of these arguments, I'm going to show you here some of the models that I've identified. I've identified through the strategic value framework of the perceived strategic value dimension and sectoral structures and organization. What we found is that in China, techno-security developmentalism have shaped bifurcated capitalism, where the Chinese government have centralized the governance of high-tech dual-use sectors and decentralized labor-intensive, less value-added ones, in the context of greater openness to the outside world. In India, neoliberal self-reliance shapes bifurcated liberalism. The conventional wisdom there is that Big Bang liberalization has opened the Indian economy, moving India away from socialist policies. But in fact, once you disaggregate the national economy and bring it to the microsectoral level, what we have found is that the government has centralized or continues to centralize the governance of smaller scale rural sectors, paying attention to these sectors with centralized ministries, and then actually decentralize the governance of high-tech, globally connected sectors, deregulating and regulating with a regulator, for example, in telecoms, and departing from the conventional wisdom of Big Bang liberalization. And the strategic value framework allows me in the Russia national and sector case studies be able to show that, in fact, security resource nationalism drives and motivates the Russian government to centralize the governance of infrastructural and resource-oriented sectors, decentralizing labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. In fact, some of these sectors are industries that Putin, in his reorganization of political power in 1998 and beyond, have left really to languish over time until very recently, until the 2014 annexation of Crimea, have then led to import substitution industrialization policies. So the response to internal and external pressures have shifted some of the governance trajectories based on the strategic value orientation, but really the dominant patterns have been the centralization of governance of infrastructural and resource sectors and the decentralization of labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. And so the strategic value framework allows me to identify these national configuration of sectoral models. And what I argue in the book is that this framework of the interaction of perceived strategic value and sectoral characteristics, that interaction is in coming together in the strategic value framework, I argue in my book, is that it could be useful for understanding development and globalization trajectories in this new age of globalization, where complex economies and new technologies and globalization trajectories have shaped how national governments think about how to govern their industries. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to just talk a little bit about the research design and methods that substantiate my arguments. This is, in fact, a triangulation of several different types of methods. I conduct semi-structured in-depth interviews, on-site field visits in China, India, and Russia across industries. I look at traditional, more labor-intensive industries such as textiles. And then I look at high-tech, capital-intensive, more value-added industries such as telecoms. I bring my study to the subsector level. So I'm able then to have some leverage in understanding potential variations in the strategic value logic, and also in the sectoral logic, and looking at these more older industries and the more high-tech industries. So for example, textiles would be an industry where we have labor-intensive, less value-added sectors in apparel and clothing. But there's also then technical textiles with contributions to the national technology base, with applications for defense sectors, for aerospace, and so forth. And so in the strategic value framework, we would then expect that countries taking objective factors into account might govern industries or subsectors even within textiles very differently, labor-intensive versus more high-tech, defense-oriented sectors of textiles. And that would be true for telecoms as well. You know, with control of information dissemination being quite important, we might expect that countries might want to keep infrastructure close to the government. But at the same time, might want to let go and decentralize and deregulate less strategic, more consumer-oriented subsectors of telecommunications. That is until information dissemination becomes important. That is until perhaps, such as in China's case with Alibaba and the Ant Group, where these monopolies, even in the value-added sectors that are more consumer-oriented, that the government has decentralized and deregulated. But when we then see that some of these monopolistic sectors where there have been more private investment, more foreign direct investment, when the government begins to feel that perhaps there is some losing of control to certain private entrepreneurs, for certain private actors that may impinge upon political legitimacy, that may impinge upon national consolidation of the Chinese Communist Party, that may impinge upon control of information. When that becomes a factor, when those internal pressures interacting with external pressures become a factor, then we might see in the strategic value logic, the state then intervene. And so that's when we might see some variations in some of the market governments of these sectors. So just quickly, I just want to make a quick few points about market governance. What I do is I come up with a typology of market governance. It helps me systematize on how we could think about what the role of the state looks like in market coordination in these economies, but in any economy per se. I identify two dimensions. I think property rights are obviously quite important, but so is the role of the state in market coordination. You can have industries, and in fact, we do see this to be true in these economies that I study, where it could be quite privatized, but the state has retained a lot of restrictions on market entry, on business scope, on technology. On the other hand, you could have, because of legacies of organization of institutions within these sectors, you could have industries where there are actually a lot of state-owned enterprises. But in fact, the state has let go of market and deregulated market entry, business scope, and technology standards. And so that's why it is important to look at both dimensions. And this conceptualization of market governance, this conceptualization of these two dimensions allow me to, in a systematic way, examine how the strategic value logic, how the sectoral logic allowed me to identify the dominant patterns at the sector level that I've mentioned already. And what I do is then I come up with this typology of market governance on these two dimensions that allow me to identify different types of governance, bring together property rights arrangements and also market coordination and the role of the state. I do want to make a comment that there are common forces of change that is in debate within scholarly literature, both in, across many different social science disciplines, certainly in political science and in sociology and economics, where open economy politics play an important role, sectoral interests, interests of business associations, industry associations, interest groups, subnational characteristics. These are large economies, particularly since the open door policy, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, where subnational characteristics, subnational governments have played important roles. Historical legacies, regime type, as I've mentioned already. And of course, global norms, markets, and organizations have played important roles. In my book, what I do is I call these factors common forces of change. And by comparing industries within these large complex economies, what I'm able to do is, in some ways, I'm able to control for some of these common forces of change. I'm able to say, in the context of openness, a greater openness to the outside world, in the context of greater openness of private stakeholders and private actors because of privatization trajectories, because of the introduction of market competition, in the context of decentralization in China's reform era, for example. I'm able to say that, well, by comparing industries within them, I'm able to identify these sectoral level patterns that have a strategic value logic, despite these common forces of change. And so the strategic value framework allows me to identify these dominant sectoral patterns of market governance, and allows me to show how sectoral structures and organization of institutions have impact on details across time. The reason the sectoral dimension is quite important is twofold. One, we're going to have path dependency, right? The fact that there are certain sectors in the Russian economy, for example, that despite the breakdown of the Soviet Union, despite privatization and massive privatization and liberalization, the fact that we still saw that at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian government holding on to the telecommunications infrastructure because of the Soviet legacy of the military-industrial complex, whereby the telecommunications infrastructure was so associated with the military sector, so associated with the defense sector that there wasn't any privatization that actually happened. There was decentralization to the regional governors, but there wasn't privatization of the landline infrastructure. So those are path dependencies that are going to continue to be important. Sectoral structures, technological attributes. Telecommunications is going to be telecommunications, whether it's in India, a democracy, or in China, an authoritarian regime. And so that's why in the strategic value framework, I bring together these two very important sets of factors. In terms of perceived strategic value, objective factors are going to be important, right? Objective factors about, a sector's importance for social political stability and regime legitimacy. How do they apply to the, or contribute to the national technology base? How could certain sectors have applications for national security and regime legitimacy and security? These are going to be important factors, measures of perceived strategic value. But how state elites define and make claims upon and contest political economic pressures will be intersubjective. And that's where the sectoral structures will come in. There are the structural attributes of sectoral structures, but then, as I've mentioned already, there are going to be path dependencies that are going to be important, and they will then have important implications for the details of how goals are going to be implemented and how measures will be employed. And so what I identify in the book through the multi-level case studies at the national, industry, sector, and firm levels is then I identify the strategic sectors as governments respond to internal and external pressures. And then I identify the less strategic sectors that will then determine these dominant patterns of market governance. And so what I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to show you that I'm actually going to focus on China and Russia, and I'm going to show you how in the post-Tiananmen era, and as China entered the World Trade Organization, techno-security developmentalism have shaped how the government has held on to in a supra-ministry state-owned infrastructure, even while allowing foreign direct investment to transfer technology and knowledge know-how in these sectors. So we have China Telecoms, China Mobile in states' hands, but we have on the equipment sector, the equipment that operates on top of state-owned infrastructure being much more open to private and foreign stakeholders. And also then on the value-added side, much more open until, as I've mentioned already, the government, responding to internal and external pressures, begins to re-regulate and centralize and bring on restrictions for market coordination, but also on the property rights dimension of what had previously been more open sectors. And textiles, though, is a sector that was highly labor intensive, less value added, do not have much implications for national security or the national technology base. So then it's been very decentralized. And in fact, the politics in these sectors are local, and where central-local relations quite important, where local governments and local governments' relationship with local industry, local firms, with foreign direct investment will have a lot of impact. At the same time, I've mentioned the strategic value logic goes to the subsector. And so technical textiles is a sector where there will be more government oversight, more government intervention on either business scope, technology standards, and so forth. And this is where we do see more government intervention. But there will be path dependencies. Even before China's entry into the World Trade Organization, because of the decentralization and deregulation, we do not see today any re-centralization of telecoms or even, of even technical textiles in China today. Happy to answer questions about the India model, neoliberal self-reliance there, but I'm going to now move on to the Russia case study, where here security resource nationalism drives, I argue, the bifurcated oligarchy, institutional foundations of capitalism in Russia. And we will see that the sectors that have more defense orientation will be the ones that the government have kept more closely watch. And this is even true despite massive privatization after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And on the other hand, we have labor-intensive light industries that have been really under the purview of local authorities, even since the days of perestroika. And that have remained to be true even with the Putin's centralization since the 98 financial crisis that led to his rising of power and and the reorganization of political power under Putin. Certainly, what we have found, in my systematic tracing of industrial trajectories, is that this the security resource orientation have shaped some of the import industrialization policies that have been adopted since recent conflicts in Russia. And so by keeping close the more defense-oriented sectors and keeping close security-oriented infrastructure, we have found that Russell Telecoms today, which in many ways was decentralized to regional governors in the post-collapse era, has since reorganization of power of Putin been undergone reorganization, undergone centralization. So we have today Russell Telecoms, a state-owned monopoly that centralizes Russia's control of telecommunications infrastructure, which certainly have aided information manipulation and information control. At the same time, we have sectors such as telecoms that essentially Russia really don't have much of an industry over, has really very much relinquished and in many ways languished since the 1980s, utilizing pretty antiquated equipment. At the same time, in 2014, we had Putin and other state leaders going into factories of technical textiles and declaring we are now the central government is now going to pay more attention to these sectors that have defense orientation, these sectors that contribute to the national technology base, that the government now will, in response to sanctions or in response to the perceived consequences of sanctions, are now going to adopt more import substitution industrialization policies in sectors that, as I've identified in the book, really have been decentralized and deregulated since even before the collapse of the Soviet Union because of the perceived strategic value and sectoral logics that I argue in the strategic value framework. Now, with all that said, I do want to conclude with the point that there is market governance, and there are state goals and the strategic value orientation, but there are also consequences for development. Some of those consequences are not always going to be always positive. For example, state intervention in development of indigenous technologies in China, for example, have not always been very successful. In fact, many of the technologies are not at all globally connected. I think 5G technology has done better, but some of that has brought in private investors and both foreign direct investment and Chinese private actors. And so and also deregulation and liberalization without strong regulation of market segments for, that may lead to overexpansion or environmental problems. Without stronger regulations in those sectors have also led to consequences that are not always positive. And so it's some of these goals and it may not always lead to very positive development outcomes. For example, on the Russia side, I want to make the point that the textiles being decentralized and relinquished even before the collapse of the Soviet Union one point is that Russia today is one of the largest luxury markets for apparel and clothing. But in fact, because Russia doesn't have a textiles industry, there's really no domestic capacity in the apparel sectors, nor is there very much domestic capacity in the technical sectors until, as I've mentioned very recently, at state attempts at import industrialization substitution. Import substitution industrialization. So I'm running out of time, but what I want to make the final argument or final say is that there are a lot of implications of this national configuration of sectoral models on global conflict and cooperation. And some of these implications have a lot of implications for some of the issues that are arising, that are some of the hottest topics today, ranging from the US-China trade war to some of the sanctions that are being imposed on Russia as it intervenes into the Ukraine. And so very happy in the Q&A to discuss some of these global conflict and cooperation implications, as well as the development outcome implications. To conclude, globalization pathways vary by country and sectors within country with these interacting strategic value and sectoral logics. Findings have shown that there are there's importance in the political dynamics during the founding of institutions, and qualify what scholars have found that whether countries can simultaneously enjoy open economies and attune to national imperatives, and how do we understand some of those national imperatives that govern sectors. And these dominant patterns are going to impact firm-level behaviors and will have impact on the varieties of capitalism that have emerged in these developing countries. And so with that, I am going to stop here, and I very much look forward to your feedback and comments and from Jean and also the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rosie. It sounds like a fascinating book, and I look forward very much to reading this in detail. There's clearly a lot in there. Let me just start off the discussion by, going back to the China case. And so from your framework, then, you could have predicted what Xi Jinping did with regard to tech in the last couple of years, particularly with Alibaba and finance and all of that. So that would be very much in keeping with your argument, because China decides that this tech industry is going to be has turned into a strategic sector.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment, Jean. And in fact, what I like to believe is that my first book, China's Regulatory State and New Strategy for Globalization, in many ways was the first to identify the strategic usage of foreign direct investment in these across industries, and that openness, macro openness to foreign direct investment, in many ways was applied quite differently across the sectors, and in ways that, as I say, vary across subsectors. And so even before China's entry into the World Trade Organization, and even before Xi Jinping rose to power in 2013, if you examine these dominant patterns of market governance and state market relations, I write about in the second book, is that even before the onset of these kind of internal and external developments, what we found is that, what I have found is that the re-regulation upon macro level liberalization is that we see very distinct patterns where the state keeps and retains the role in market coordination, even as the state has let go of some of the property rights arrangements.
Right, but let me just sort of ask sort of push you a bit. So, given the U.S.-China, the very tense U.S.-China relations, some would argue that all of this renewed emphasis that China is pouring a lot of money into tech because of supply chain problems, because of what the U.S. has done, for example, to Huawei, and but this also is embedded a bigger question that I'd like to, and you may obviously address in your book, and we obviously, you have so much in there, you couldn't talk about it. But how do you take into account the changes in what a strategic sector would be at any given time? Because obviously you're talking about a long range of time, right. And obviously something like tech wasn't important to China necessarily. I mean, it certainly is not as important as now, say back when the reforms started. So how does that work in your model, in your framework?
Yeah, so I mentioned that, obviously internal and external pressures as they come across time will play an important role in terms of how the state, values, defines, and make claims upon what would be considered strategic, right? On some of the objective measures of strategic value. And so if we, I mentioned the Russia case where, textiles was, including technical textiles, was very much let go even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it wasn't really until there were some external pressures, right? Sanctions. And some of it is objective, but some of it is intersubjective. It's the perceived value, the perception of the impact of Western sanctions led to, a more close examination of sectors that might have impact on the national technology base, that might have impact on defense-oriented defense-oriented production. And so even apparel and clothing, any firms that, or many of the firms, and of course some of those firms that did receive the subsidies are going to be ones that are closely connected to the Kremlin.
Right. So let me just sort of then throw this in there and say, so the U.S. by its actions is sort of pushing China precisely in the opposite direction of what it wants. And so instead of opening up and the economy and getting the state out, reducing subsidies, US's actions are making them put more money in. Would you agree with that? Is that what seems to be the one implication of your argument? Am I understanding this correctly?
Okay. So I think it's important to be able to examine industrial trajectories over time. And I think that one of the things that I am able to do in the book is that I do systematically look across time. And I think if we take snapshots or moments in time, it may appear so that, as you say, the US-China trade war, for example, has only exacerbated or pushed China to more closely hold on to certain sectors that have implications for defense and national technology base and political legitimacy and so forth. But I think if we look across time, what we view and identify to be true is that in 2000, right around the time that China joined the World Trade Organization, for example, the conventional wisdom at that time was that China is going to liberalize, there's going to be macro liberalization, and that China is going to be, quote unquote, a normal country, right? Just like the rest of the globalized world.
Well, I don't know if everybody would have said that.
And obviously, I think China specialists like yourself and other China watchers were, there were plenty of people who were much more skeptical. But there were also many who who identified that potentially, we're going to see more of an impact of interest groups and lobbying and so forth. But in fact, by tracing across time, what we see is that there's actually quite a lot of bifurcation and distinct trajectories where that may be true in certain sectors. And even in more strategic sectors, there might be more voices of certain stakeholders, the Jack Ma's and the Alibabas and the Tencents and the Huawei's, but in fact that that allowing more voices for actual policy influence in some of these subsectors never really came to the forefront, never really in fact happened and never really came to the forefront, to a point where I would argue that by the time that Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, there've been actually a lot of consolidation of political control in certain economic sectors that are the most important sectors to the Chinese government, that it actually created an institutional foundation in which Xi Jinping is then able to politically clean the house, to some extent for the Chinese Communist Party, but also for personal gain, right? For at least for his own allies within the Chinese Communist Party. And so, in many ways, by being able to, well, first of all, examine across industries, but also across time, I'm able to identify that, in fact, China really, in fact, never really liberalized on the macro level as we might have expected, and which is why it is a national configuration of sectoral models.
So basically then, because a lot of people have been concerned because she seems to be putting a lot more, let's put it this way, reasserting the importance of SOEs to the detriment of private firms. But if you're right, if one were to go and actually look at what the SOEs are today, that and I don't know if you did this in the book, but that therefore the ones that are still SOEs would be essentially all of the strategic sectors, and you would predict that in all the others, they really have actually done the reforms and and basically let them go.
Yeah, so I do want to point out that not all the reforms have worked, right? I mean, just because the intentions are not always going to match outcomes, right? So that is true. But in fact, it is true that if we do map out, in which I do provide some data for, right? We don't always have all the data that we want in some of these more closed, politically closed economies. I do provide some data to show that, in fact, it is true in these more labor-intensive, less value-added sectors, we see a lot more private actors. We see town and village enterprises. We see the local state corporatism that you have identified in your important work. We see the town and village enterprises that are red hat enterprises, but really in fact operate as private enterprises. But it is in the strategic sectors where, particularly the infrastructural sectors, where the government has retained the most control. Now, one of the reasons why I have identified the two dimensions of market governance as market coordination and property rights arrangements is because it's not perfectly true, right? There are still state-owned enterprises in textiles, for example, particularly in certain localities and in certain regions, and even in telecoms, well, short of the China mobiles and China telecoms, even in telecoms and in equipment and value-added services, we have private actors. But market coordination is important. That's why I have those two dimensions, to allow us to kind of be able to identify variations across subsectors. But on the large dominant patterns, I would say that, yeah, the strategic value framework and the expectations of the strategic value framework really do very much match, what we would expect of, states' closeness and oversight over the strategic sectors, and much deregulation, decentralization in the less strategic sectors.
Let me sort of take you into a slightly different direction, but given that you did look at China and Russia,
Yeah.
and then you also mentioned in the Russia case that, what happened in Crimea in Georgia, that it also affected their actions. So given the need for security, the strategic sectors, does this then also affect countries that they're going to form alliances with? So in other words, the increasing closeness, or at least show of increasing closeness between China and Russia, does that make sense to you, or can your framework help us understand why this may be happening now?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So in terms of kind of the potential implications for China-Russia relations of that, encroaching re-regulation of kind of, previously less examined sectors. So I will take the case of technical textiles again, particularly, and this is up and down the supply chain as well. So not just the more downstream sectors of the products part, but also more upstream sectors that use, Russia's existing resources in oil and petrochemicals, right? Existing natural resources, but also existing knowledge-based resources in chemistry and so forth, science and technology out of the military industrial complex. In technical textiles, that those import subsidies, new regulations, taxation, and so forth that protect and promote domestic sector in technical textiles in Russia. After years of neglect, we have found that, for example, in Sieber, one of the, it's a private enterprise that used to be part of Gazprom, right? Famously nationalized in 2005. They've spun off Sieber, and it's a privatized but state-controlled company. That company has in recent years, after state subsidies, have invested in new capacities in technical textiles, in fiber processing, in chemical fiber processing, to a point that in the late 2010s, in 2016 through 2019, we have Silk Fund, the Silk Road Fund, a state-owned fund in China, coming in to invest in those new capacities. And then coming from those new capacities, we came out agreements between Sinopec and some of Sieber's subsidiaries to supply China micro fibers that tap into these technical textile products that really a lot of private companies in China use, and also the Chinese government uses too for the kind of more defense sector needs. And so there we have, by disaggregating the national economy and taking it to the sector, subsector level, we are uncovering, my book has uncovered these industrial level actions that otherwise would have been missed and overlooked.
But let me ask you, that's a fascinating example. So does this mean that they allowed this, both China and Russia, they did this because of their regime type? In other words, they wouldn't have done this were it not for the fact that you've got two authoritarian systems?
Yeah, I think that I think it's the objective goals of national governments, right, whether democracies or authoritarian regimes, to want to increase the national technology base, to want to protect its national security and so forth. But I do think that this is where regime type does matter. Right, I don't entirely, I don't say that regime type doesn't matter. I think regime type matters in terms of what these national governments will do with what
Right.
has.
Well, this is why it was really interesting looking at India. It was fascinating because, India is sort of, on the one hand, it's known for, in some ways, for the tech. Certainly sitting on Silicon Valley, we have a lot of, tech folks here. But that's the sector that the government sort of has let the private actors really take the lead. It's interesting, but at the same time, given its importance, are there any signs that the state has maybe rethinking this?
Yeah, thank you for this question, and also for bring in the India cases. And I think that's where I think the state responses to internal and external pressures angle really matters here too, because of it. In fact, it is true of late. India, in response to kind of internal rumblings about the increasing dominance of Chinese FDI in India across sectors, but particularly in, as you say, in the high-tech ICT telecom sectors, India has most recently really in a very unprecedented way since Big Bang globalization restricted foreign direct investment in telecoms and ICT. Before the FDI restrictions were for, they identified, countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, right? Countries that have borders with India, that have some military kind of, potential border security issues. But China, which does have a border with India, was never really part of that thinking or restrictions against FDI. Well, most recently, China has been added to restrictions of Chinese FDI into these sectors that have been let go. And so that's in response to an external pressure from China, but in some ways it's an internal pressure too. Because
also, I mean, the fighting, right? I mean, the actual battles that they didn't.
Yes. So externally,
can you time it? Is it possible to really sort of time it, sort of coordinate the timing of when those happened and what happens, what they did about the restrictions?
Yeah, in fact, in a way, it's a natural experiment for me, right? Like I didn't time it, no control from any government, but it's a natural experiment in that, in fact, that's what happened right after the border skirmishes, and that's when the FDI restrictions came in. And despite the fact that China was already increasingly encroaching on, across different sectors in terms of dominance in investment. And this is investment, oriented again, whether it's state-owned or state-funded investment or investment from Chinese private industry. Yeah, and it's quite fascinating. And if I may, just kind of draw out both the importance of the objective and intersubjective dimensions of strategic value in looking at textiles in India. In that, in textiles in India, it's unlike ICT and telecoms. It's a sector that, Big Bang globalization or not, the government had held quite closely to. And in some ways it's objective, right? Small scale industry in India, and also labor intensive industry, objectively is a huge part of employment for the Indian economy.
Well, I mean, it's not so much, well, it's certainly employment, but because of the fact that it is a democracy and the elections.
Yes.
I mean, would you see that is actually the real explanation of why they kept that control?
Yeah,
the world small scale industry, for example.
The political and economic dimensions of strategic value does empower me to take into account electoral imperatives, right? So we have both objective economic imperatives, but also the political imperatives, where they're constituencies, as you say,
right?
These are huge constituencies, but it's also intersubjective, and it's intersubjective because of legacies of cotton nationalism and the nationalist imagination about the important role cotton and apparel and clothing have played in the independence of India from the Great Britain, rooted in, again, some of the more objective internal and external pressures, because under, during British imperialism, the British dumping of textiles from Manchester, right, coming into India had affected Indian, not just Indian large-scale textile mills, but also the small-scale industry. So this kind of interplay of objective and intersubjective factors really, could be traced historically. And so what I do in the book is that I do look at 1980 and beyond, but I also have historical chapters for each of these three countries where I show from sectoral origins that responding to internal and external pressures, that strategic value orientation.
But in the case of India, for example, I don't know if this is true. I'm not an India specialist, but I know that there's still a lot of poverty, and the rural areas could use more development. So is this in fact keeping the rural areas from developing faster than they might otherwise do because there is so much government control?
Yeah, so in my interviews, with technical sectors in textiles, in India, is that I find that even with attempts at export industrialization, some of these kind of made in India policies that Modi had implemented of late, even with some of these policies, because of continued reservations for handlooms and power looms, continued protections, and some of these protections, they are pretty specific and nuanced, and you really have to really disaggregate to the product line level, right? Because of these continued protections and subsidies, there are technical sectors that probably could be developed more, but are prevented from doing so. And so, whereas, even in Russia, you have technical textiles and large modern, manufacturing facilities today, in India, you have power looms that to this very day that are very labor intensive and use very kind of less technologically advanced technology.
So in that sort of situation, how then does change come about?
How do change come about? And I think that's a really important question, and a really important question, particularly for people who care about development, right? Development specialists and practitioners who think about development models and what can we do, right? What can we do in the face of of authoritarian regimes and the strong and the inclination of strong states to for political motivations? What can we do because of path dependency of institutions? I do think that some careful attention to some of how some of these existing policies, for example, in India, might have unintended consequences, right? By keeping with some of these, old policies that are on the books, or maybe even new policies that are pushed by certain, sectoral interests, particularly in democracies. By keeping them in the books, they will lead to effects that may not be as positive for economic development. And I think careful examination of these policies and political leadership on what could be done to recalibrate could be helpful.
Well, our time is almost up, but I'd like to just throw a question at you. And I know this is sort of tough, and you probably, I'm not sure you could answer it, but, this is, given the fact that you are arguing that external, foreign global pressures really do shape internal behavior. So, this book is coming out in May. So what this book goes to the White House, goes to Washington. What should policymakers take away in terms of how they might get Russia or China to behave in ways that the U.S. would find more, would like better?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think you're certainly right. This is not easy question to answer. I've been thinking, about the sanctions, right? I think that's kind of the hot topic of the day, particularly President Biden, announced some renewed sanctions that will lead to comprehensive sanctions, right? As he had promised. And I think if we just look at some of the new sanctions that were announced yesterday and compare it to sanctions by the United States in 2014, they're actually not that different, at least not yet. They are, targeted towards, individuals and state-owned institutions that are closely connected to Putin, right? And so I think in some ways, some of the findings of the book empowers us to examine and kind of think about and calibrate what, well, first of all, think about whether sanctions can work and, where maybe some unintended consequences. Right. And then also think about, well, if we are to stick with sanctions, which I'm not advocating for, dropping them entirely, but if we are to stick with them, what kind of sanctions would actually work? Right? By keeping it, in some ways very narrow and targeted, and not necessarily, maybe going to the industry level, to the subsector, perhaps.
But I'm just want to be clear. Yeah. But the implication, the big takeaway is that these external pressures really shape the sort of sectoral development in these countries. Am I correct?
External pressures can, and I do think that, I do want to bring back a regime type, right? Like there are going to be some external pressures matter, but there are going to be, internal objectives, right? And some of these internal objectives are not, they're not necessarily going to be about, the interests of industry. The internal objectives are going to be about, political legitimacy and political stability. And so some of these internal objectives are going to shape what kind of policies that will get implemented. But if we are going to, but what the United States can do is right, we could control some of the external pressures. And in at least, in the example of sanctions, by keeping them as narrow as we have so far. Now, I don't know if, what else is in the works, but by keeping it as narrow as we have so far, then we may not be, the sanctions may not be being directed in a way that could actually have effects.
Right.
Right. Is what I'm trying to say. But then again, these are hard questions.
No, I definitely understand.
National leaders.
Apologies, but I couldn't resist because your findings in this book, there's a lot in there. So I thought I would throw it out there.
Yes,
just
thank you.
Get the benefit of your thought. Well, our time is up, but I wanted to let me see. There's a question that has come in that I wanted to make sure. I think we can do it. So it says, could it be explained in terms of long-term negative effects of a very confrontational U.S. policy on Russia and China?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that question. To the audience member, I want to problematize a little bit about what we mean by confrontational U.S. foreign policy, right? I think, one of the starting points of the study is that we have these countries that are, globalizing, during the neoliberal era, right? And so in many ways, kind of not just the United States, but really global policy has been, accepting and integrating, China and Russia into the global economy. And so in that sense, at least on foreign economic policy, the United States and Western allies have not actually, in fact, been that quote unquote, restrictive or confrontational to China and Russia. And by this, I do take kind of a long view, right? Like, across the neoliberal era since the end of the Cold War. And so I guess that's how I would see it. Now, if anything, I think, let's go back to sanctions again, right? Well, why are we even having sanctions, right? That's in response to what we could argue are confrontational actions taken by Russia, in the Russian case, towards its neighbors, and towards its neighbors based on national narratives, right? It was just a couple of days ago, Putin, claiming that there was, or having ideas about, like, is there an Ukrainian national state or identity to begin with? And so,
well, yeah. No, I mean, this is in some ways sort of a natural experiment that you could maybe take advantage of in sort of writing in a few years an update to see, because I think that as with more confrontational policies, to see if in fact you're going to see more changes of the type that you have documented up until this point. So in any case, this is fascinating, and we look forward to actually having the book and appreciating all the richness of your research. So thank you very much, and thank you for the audience of the questions. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.